This morning I want to share out of the book of Genesis. I will be talking about the story of Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, who became known as Israel, and his ordeal, his trials and tribulation that he went through. I'm actually going to start at the end of the story in Genesis 50. If you want to read this, it's between Genesis 37 and 50. But this is the end we read in Genesis 50:15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father commanded this commandment before he died. Say to Joseph, 'Please forgive the transgressions of your brothers and their sins, because they did evil to you. And now, please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of our father.'" And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." And thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. They meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. What was planned and designed by Joseph's brothers to destroy him ended up saving their own lives. It's one of the great turnaround stories in the Bible, where someone who was unjustly treated ended up, through a series of events in prison, and one day went from the prison cell to the throne of Egypt, promoted, delivered, exalted before the Lord. He went through many years of trouble, but in the end, God had a purpose for what he suffered. Now we read in 37:3, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was a son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved them more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers the dream, they hated him even more." So Israel had shown special favor to his son Joseph, loving him, giving him a robe of many colors. And then Joseph had two dreams where he saw his brothers and his father and mother bowing down before him. Well, of course, the jealousy and rivalry between him and his brothers was at an all-time high. and they despised him. They hated him. They plotted evil plots against him, and they were out taking care of the sheep. And Israel sent Joseph to check up on his brothers, and they plotted how they could get rid of this dreamer. And they argued amongst each other, and finally they decided to spare his life and instead throw him in a pit. And later, they sold him into slavery to some Midianites. And they devised this plan to tell their father, who loved Joseph so much, that he was killed by a ferocious beast, taking goat's blood and putting it on his robe to complete the deception. All these evil things they had done against their brother because of jealousy and envy. All the sin they committed against him. And they suffered much guilt and shame over what they had done. But in the end, they were forgiven by Joseph himself. And God turned around the whole situation, taking what was meant for evil and bringing good. But you have to think of this journey for Joseph. He was a young man. He was honored and blessed by his father. In that fateful morning day, he was rejected, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery. He certainly could have felt that life was unfair, and he could even have been mad at God. But there's no indication that he blamed God. Things were spinning out of control in his life, and he hadn't done anything foolish or sinful to bring this about upon himself. Evil was happening against him. It happens against all of us at different times of our lives because of the world we live in, because of the evil in the world, because of evil in people's hearts, because sin abounds in our culture. But in the midst of suffering, we can remember the example of Joseph. He didn't give up. He didn't become bitter. He didn't get full of despair. He trusted God. He waited on God. He prayed, and God was with him in all that he went through. We read that he was sold to Potiphar, an official of the Pharaoh. But we read in 39:2 that the Lord was with Joseph, and he made him successful man. And Potiphar put him in charge of his whole household. Joseph was promoted to the highest position, even though he remained a slave. So even in the midst of this trouble and problems, God was showing favor and kindness to Joseph. But he still remained a slave. He still was not where he wanted to be. And it gets worse before it gets better. Place of honor and blessing in Potiphar's household, but his wife was harassing him, was trying to seduce him, and finally found a way to trap him and falsely accuse him of taking advantage of her. And this trusted servant was cast out and sent to prison. Another person who had lied and cheated and done evil against Joseph. But again, this was God's plan, getting him in the right place at the right time, for the right season, for what God was going to do, not just for Joseph, but for Israel, for all the tribe, the clan, the sons of Jacob. And even when he was in prison, again we read in Genesis 39:21, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Again, he was promoted. He's being prepared for something. We have to remember sometimes when we go through what we go through in life, it isn't just because of what's happening to you now. You're being prepared for something in the future. You know, when Joseph went into this season of trial and tribulation for him, he was a young man. He was immature. He was learning how to handle responsibility, even in places like prison. He was learning how that God would meet him in the midst of difficulties. He was growing in his faith, in his commitment to God, in his faithfulness. But it must have been very hard. His dreams were delayed, set aside. How could he ever see what God had promised was so clear to him? Must have looked so distant in this ordeal that he was in. But see, nobody understood, not even Joseph, the divine purpose, the divine plan that was at work. How God would take that which seemed terrible and bad and evil and use it for good. How he would bring Joseph through the refining fires of tribulation, and he would come out a stronger, wiser man. I'm sure he longed to be with his family. He was in a foreign land, not only in prison, but he longed to be with his family. But God was about to change everything. In his time, he did. There were two prisoners who had dreams. One, and they were troubled by their dreams, and they went to Joseph. He interpreted their dreams accurately. One of them was put to death. I don't think he was too pleased with that interpretation. Probably wouldn't have got too much money for interpreting that dream. The other one was exalted and returned to his position with the Pharaoh as the chief cupbearer. Now, Joseph was just being faithful to the gift that God had given him, the wisdom to interpret dreams, and this was an opportunity for him to use that gift. And he also saw that this was an opportunity to put in a good word for himself. He had been treated unjustly. He had been sold in slavery. He had been falsely accused and thrown in prison. If he could just get the ear of the Pharaoh, maybe he would have a chance of being released. It was a great plan. Joseph did what he could. Unfortunately, because of the humanness of the cupbearer, he forgot all about Joseph. And several years passed by. But you see, God had planted a seed. He had created a situation that would, in time, be the very thing that would help release Joseph from his prison. So now, it wasn't just two prisoners who had a dream, it was Pharaoh himself. He had several dreams, and they were very powerful dreams, troubling. And in the conversation, the cupbearer told Pharaoh about this Hebrew young man who was in prison unjustly, who would interpret accurately the dreams of the two prisoners. So he was able to come before Pharaoh and to hear the dream and interpret the dreams accurately, because they were dreams that were meant to warn people of what was to come. Time of great plenty, of great harvest, a great abundance for 7 years, and then a time of great famine that would consume all the abundance that the 7 years of good times had brought. And God gave the interpretation to Joseph in the council, and he gave him favor in the eyes of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh realized he had a dilemma. He needed help. He needed an administrator, someone who could wisely take care of storing grain and all that there was during the years of plenty so that they could survive through the famine. And he appointed Joseph. Joseph was released from prison. He was put in a position second only to Pharaoh himself. He was given a place of great responsibility. And it was during this time, during the time of the famine, that Israel sent his sons, several of his sons, to go to Egypt because there was grain in Egypt, because they were not surviving on what they had. They had to have more. Again, all a part of God's plan. So we have this interesting scenario where the ones who did such evil against Joseph are now before him. And he tests them for a while. And I know when I read this story, I almost say, go for it, Joseph. Make them sweat. They deserve every bit of it. The evil things that they did. But he doesn't persist in that attitude. But he does test them. He finds out things about them and about Benjamin. And you can read, again, all about this in Genesis. But the amazing thing is through this trial and tribulation, through this ordeal, redemption and salvation had come to the whole family, to all who were part of Joseph's family, of Israel's sons. And they all were eventually brought to Egypt and given a place in Goshen where they were protected, where they were taken care of by Pharaoh himself and through Joseph, where all their needs were provided for. This was an amazing story of redemption and salvation brought by the suffering and the hardship that one person endured. And it gives us hope. Hope that God can change things even in our lives, turn things to good, and that there is purpose behind what we endure. But I want to close with talking about another person in the Bible who in many ways, Joseph's life was a type, a shadow of this person who would come, who was sinless and perfect and righteous in every way, who fully obeyed God, his Father, his whole life, followed his ways, fulfilled his law, who had no evil or sin in him that he should be treated the way he was treated. He was like Joseph. Evil was done against him unjustly. He was rejected and hated and denied and betrayed and forsaken and beaten and crucified by his own leaders, by some of his own disciples who Judas who betrayed him. Even Pilate said that there was no reason for Jesus to be crucified, that he was innocent man. And yet all this evil descended upon Jesus. All these dark, terrible things came upon him suddenly. Actually, many hard things he endured throughout his public ministry. But see, what others meant to destroy and discredit and limit and shame, and Jesus, God meant for good because of his plan. He was humbled even to the point of death on the cross. He descended into hell itself and experienced the horrors of God's judgment. And yet, God raised him from the dead, exalted him to the right hand of the Father, where he has a name above every name. All that was done to Jesus, inspired by Satan himself, by demons and fallen angels, by sinful men, of powerful people in his culture and his time, all the evil done to him in his crucifixion, in his being scourged 39 times before he was crucified. All the false accusations and the mockery and the brutality that he experienced, all that evil was done against him, an innocent person, the most perfect, beautiful person that had ever lived, God's own Son. But all of that brought salvation, redemption, forgiveness, opened up the doors, not just for those who had done evil in the first century against the Lord Jesus Christ of Nazareth, but for all humanity to be forgiven, to be saved. Even as Joseph went forth through the trials and tribulations that he did to suffer for the sake of his family, Jesus suffered for our sake. And God caused that suffering to be the very thing that brought healing and forgiveness. You see, we may not suffer like Jesus did himself, or even like Joseph did, or like others who have been persecuted and suffered greatly for their faith in Jesus Christ. But we've all experienced hardships and injustice in our life. We've all had experienced betrayal, disappointment, and people letting us down, people falsely accusing us, people rejecting us, harassing us, maybe circumstances that were out of our control, disasters, accidents, troubles that we had no responsibility in causing. And even if we cause some of the troubles that we go through, and we all do, for we all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and sin brings consequences. It brings trouble into your life. We've all made mistakes. We've all acted foolishly. We've all lacked maturity and wisdom and obedience to God, and brought things upon ourselves that can be most terrible and difficult. But even with those things, God is able to change and restore and renew and revitalize and heal and deliver. He's able to take the worst of our lives and make it part of our testimony to others who are going through the same thing. It's a part of our process of our coming into maturity, preparing us for what He has called us for, the destiny that He has given us, the good that He wants to do through us to others. As Jesus suffered for our sake, we suffer for each other's sake, for those whom God would call through our lives and ministry, through the uniqueness of our experience. Our testimony becomes a powerful tool in the hand of the Lord, so that we have compassion on those who suffer or have suffered in the same way, or those who have struggled with the same issues or addictions or habits or hang-ups, as Celebrate Recovery says. If we can see salvation in the midst of those things, we can point others to the same hope that God can come through for them. So we have to realize it isn't all about our personal comfort at this level, this stage of our life. It's not all about your personal happiness and contentment or convenience in your life. God has great plans, bigger plans than we ever can imagine. He has a way of weaving everything together for good for those who love God and were called according to His purpose. Doesn't seem to be good at the time. It can be greatly troublesome and unjust. But God is in the redemption business. He takes the broken down and what seems to be crushed, and He restores, He revives, to bring Himself glory, doing things that no other person in the universe can do. He did that through His Son, Jesus Christ, and He continues to do that in our lives. He continues to do that in the world around us, even when the world looks like it's in a self-destructive mode. And we are very self-destructive as human beings because we refuse to listen and believe and trust in God's Word. Even when it seems like all is lost, God's plans are working. He's looking for people who will say yes to Him in the midst of the trouble and not hold on to bitterness and not become resentful or revengeful, but rather forgive even as Christ has forgiven, and who will have faith in something better and greater to come than their own personal happiness in this moment. So we thank the Lord for His goodness, that what was meant for evil, He used for good, to save a whole nation. Before it was even a nation, all of Israel was saved because of Joseph's trials and tribulation and his faithfulness, and that God exalted him to a place where he could help his family. Amen. As we continue and